a lecture at this conference about metamorphosis, disintegration, integration, and conscious living. And during this year, I thought a lot about these subjects. I made some research, I was really into it, thinking, living with it, but unable to write a word well structured about it. And I was somehow stuck somewhere in my mind. But the very interesting thing is to take a look at what was going on in my life during this past year. While I was trying to think about disintegration, my life was going through a real phase of disintegration and destruction. I was experiencing a terrible situation in which my entire professional life was attacked and challenged. And you will see that there is a big difference between what David was talking about and what I was experiencing in my country during the same time. The French authorities, through several administrations, the police and the judicial system, tried to stop my work, my institute, and my transpersonal practice. And they have accused me of various reprehensible activities, and I was suspected to be a dangerous sect, to use practices that harm people, put people in danger, especially through breath work, automatic breath work, and sweat lodges. So you have to know that what you are doing. They consider these practices as mental manipulation and all these sort of accusations. They wanted, and they still want, to take me to court for these reasons. They have also tried to ruin my reputation and the reputation of my institute with so much efficiency that I will have to close this school quite soon. This situation was and still is like a tsunami in my life. My engagement in the transpersonal movement is so crucial and central for me that these attacks have touched the most sensitive part of my life. It took me quite a lot of time to realize that the reasons I could not prepare this talk at the thinking level was because I was personally involved in the topic of this conference. It's not an easy thing when you are in the middle of a storm to grasp and understand the teachings and the messages you can get from it. At first, I didn't want to share this experience publicly. But if I want to be honest with you, I cannot speak theoretically about disintegration disconnected from my own experience that was and still is so present. So there are two levels I would like to consider from this story, which is mine, of course, but not only mine, because it reveals important parameters of the collective evolution of our society and our world. I will come back to this second point later. So, talking on the personal level, I was put in a state of total loss, chaos, uncertainty, and fragility. I couldn't grasp anything to find a basis for a feeling of safety. It was a very difficult and painful time. Some days, I have to say that I felt so miserable, so lost and overwhelmed, especially when I discovered new negative informations or accusations, attacks. But this is where psychological and spiritual work have been really helpful. I very quickly realized that even if the circumstances were unfair and based on false information, I wouldn't stay in a state of victim, which was the worst place to be, a place where I was losing my inner power and responsibility. When we experience such destructive multiple attacks, there is a strong tendency, when you are a psychologist, to ask why? Why me? Why did I do wrong to experience such a disaster? I quickly decided that why was not the right question. It was, for me, it was a waste of time, because the answers depend on the level you look at. And with our minds, we can create so many stories to explain what is happening and why it is happening. Starting from my childhood, my past lives, my ancestors, my genealogy, and so on, and so on. All the answers I could consider have been true, but the question still remain. Does it help me to ask why? I decided to focus more on what for. Not in the sense of finding a good reason or explanation that would have transformed the incessant aggression into a kind of epic that I had to go through as the hero has to do in his journey. No, it was much more simple and humble. What I often said was, I don't understand why I'm there, why I have to experience this, but why not? And what can I learn during this process itself, day after day, and sometimes minutes after minute? It reminds me of what we often say when we accompany and teach people in breath work. We often say, trust the process. Even if you don't understand what's happening, trust this inner intelligence inside of you that knows better than your mind. So this is something I was used to say to other people. So it was time, to bring this back to my own experience. When we are challenged in our life, maybe there is an intelligent process that's unfolding to offer us circumstances that may lead us to a new stage of evolution. So, about disintegration, what part of us is facing disintegration? I was very aware that it was my ego, my sense of who I am, my identity that were threatened and humiliated, lots of humiliations. But also my social life, what I built, my home that I could lose, my professional accomplishments that were dissolving, the institute I created close to disappearing. I had to face the risk of a big loss, the destruction of everything that mattered in my professional commitments in service to the transpersonal domain. I was attacked because of my choices in the transpersonal field, my transpersonal practice as a psychotherapist, and my attempts to establish a transpersonal curriculum in psychotherapy in my country. During this process, meditation was one of my principal tools. My practice, my personal practice to come back to myself and to the present moment. I also needed a body practice to keep contact with my living body and feel my vitality and my breath moving through it. For me, this practice is Tai Chi. And day after day, I try to stay connected with all my feelings, reactions, and emotions. Some days, anxiety and despair were my companions. But most of the time, when I was there, I could come back to my center, to my axis, and just breathe, letting go of all the images and stories my mind tried to create about the situation and events that occurred. But this was, and this is a process and a practice which requires commitment, discipline, and faith. This is not at all magic. I have also extensively used a practice taught by my spiritual teacher, Richard Moss, he's from California, which is named the Mandala of Being. It's a way of watching every emotion and thought and questioning them to realize they are just a creation of the mind and not who we are. Even if we feel desperate and lost, we have the choice of staying a victim of the circumstances and a victim of our thoughts about these circumstances, which is often worse. Or the choice to leave this survival structure and breathe in the space which is the center of the mandala, and the center which are called the center, the now, of or the beginning of ourselves. And so my practice was to do so, and to stay there with no hope, no comment, just connected to the sensation of my body, which is always in the present moment. Our body doesn't lie. It's always here and now. And it's a sort of starting point of the reality we create at each moment. Some words about resistances. Disintegration is fascinating because there is a huge power of imagination in it. The first reaction of the ego is to say, no, I don't want this. It's so we will try to escape, and the practice is to learn to say yes, and to let go of fear, resentment, anger, and to open our heart to life and to love. But when the difficult feelings are still there, which happens sometimes, and don't want to let go, then the practice is to hold them in our heart, as if we were holding a wounded child, the wounded child that we are in those moments of powerlessness. The instinctual reaction is to resist against disintegration. And this is exactly what I did for a while. It took me a while to really accept, to let go of any hope, and to stay open to a new step, a new phase in my life. In our daily life, we often meet circumstances that create reactions inside of us. We like, we don't like, we are angry, we are frustrated, we feel hurt, we are upset. We refuse what life is presenting to us, especially with our relationships with others. And all these reactions support our egoic structure, our survival personality. They are linked to our defense mechanisms, which merely define our character. But when we are facing terrible life accidents, we may touch suffering at a different level. We may experience places in us that threaten our ego, threaten our life, and put us in a state of total annihilation. And this is generally connected with what we call archaic states. States where the sense of me is not well established. When we don't have a clear, separate identity. Richard Mars calls and names this untamed emotions or untamed feelings. This is where we have to face emotional forces that seem bigger than our possibility of dealing with them. So can we experience metamorphosis without going through this stage of disintegration and annihilation? I don't think so. In the hero's journey, these untamed feelings are like the monsters we have to face in order to accomplish our destiny. All our life can be seen like a death and rebirth process. You know that. In order to grow, we need to let go and to let the past identities die. For the infant to become a baby, for the baby to become a child, and so on, until our last breath, when we enter this new state of consciousness we call death. Every 7 years, most of the cells of our body are renewed, which means that somehow we are not the one we were 7 years before. The physical transformation is obvious for any human being. But what about the evolution of our consciousness? I'm sure that for most of us, we could agree that the main challenges we experienced during our lifetime were the times of greatest changes. If you are a psychotherapist, you know that most of the time people come to your office because their suffering is unbearable and they need to understand, to make sense, and to get rid of it. And this will happen through a process which could be called facing the shadow. Not understanding the shadow, but meeting it, embracing it, creating a mature relationship with it. The shadow is a place we don't want to stay. We don't want to recognize it, but it is also a huge reservoir of vital energy that is stuck because we are afraid to release the monsters and to be annihilated by them. Shadow and disintegration are connected to fear, or even to terror. But what do we do when we are full of fear? The first reaction is to run away, or try to elaborate strategies to hide or ignore the fear of annihilation. But what will happen if we stay there? Like in the hero's journey, what will happen if we stay present? If we stay still and quiet in front of it? Not moving, but opening our heart to it. In concrete daily life, sometimes we have to fight. I personally have to fight against the administrations, against the unfair decisions they put on me. But I try to be very attentive, not to fight against, but rather to fight for. Fighting against means reinforcing the power of the others, making them enemies. This is useless and ineffective. Fighting for supports our energy connects us to our values and choices, and enhances our ability to be a conscious human being. Following a path that has a heart, said Don Juan to Castaneda. The warrior needs to manifest his strength and power, and at the same time to recognize his vulnerability, his fear. It's all about relationship and how to stay present with whatever we feel and whatever happens. And also accepting to fail sometimes and to start again, even when we think we are crushed. In challenging times, we may have to start again to climb the mountain from the very beginning, because we may fall down at every step. This is about faith, trust, and letting go, and this is an ongoing process. And this is what I will call becoming a disciple. In this type of process, I think we do not integrate. The theme is integration. I think we do not integrate. I think, personally, that the integration comes by itself if we travel consciously through our thoughts, emotions, and reactions. One day, we feel the resistance has gone, and we feel free of the fear or the attachments, even if we cannot explain how it happened. Of course, I speak from my own experience. Maybe it's not true for you. What is conscious living? To me, it's not a result. It's a process. The process that can describe how to grow through disintegration without going insane or falling into some form of permanent regression. Whatever the circumstances are, we always have a choice. The choice to create our relationship with any event at any moment. Maybe we don't choose, we don't decide the event, but we can choose the relationship we will have with them. Again, to stay a victim of these circumstances, or are we going to choose to become a disciple and learn from the circumstances and the events in our lives? Conscious living, to me, means staying present, witnessing all our internal reactions, and acting as much as possible from the center of the mandala, which is our essence, our deep connection with the source. It also means not blaming others, but taking our own responsibility for our life and what is happening. Living consciously with an open heart is what could be the essence of a transpersonal way of life. And above all, there is our connection with the mystery. Living consciously doesn't mean we understand the sense of what happens to us. We are invited to surrender to the ineffable mystery of life. I would like now to talk about a very well-known metaphor, which is the metamorphosis of the caterpillar into a butterfly. You all know this story. But we can look at it at the level of the personal transformation, which is what we easily understand, the death and rebirth process. The caterpillar has to die to become this beautiful butterfly. But if we consider the process from the human point of view, That means that when the caterpillar in us is dying, it has no idea what will be the result, except its experience of disappearing. This is where we can experience fear or faith, or fear and faith. This is where I am, trying to hold these two feelings like the two sides of a scale and stay in the middle in order to cultivate my faith and to recognize my fear when it appears. I would like to open the second part of my talk, which will be shorter, and leave the personal aspect to address now the level of the collective. It's really interesting to look at this metaphor from the point of view of collective transformation. Let's tell the story of this caterpillar. We all know the result. However, it's not the result I would like to look at today, but the process itself of how the caterpillar becomes a butterfly. Inside the caterpillar, there is what biologists call imaginal cells. These cells are sleeping and inactive as long as the caterpillar is alive. And at a certain stage of its evolution, the caterpillar becomes really voracious and starts to eat everything it can find. It eats 100 times its weight. This is how sometimes you may find a bush with no leaves just because one caterpillar has eaten all of them. Then the caterpillar will find a place to stay and begins to create a cocoon until it is totally contained in it. And once the cocoon is solidified, an incredible process will begin. These imaginal cells wake up and start to migrate together and form what the biologists call imaginal discs, which will design the future structure of the butterfly. But then something remarkable appears. Although this is the normal biological evolution for a caterpillar, these discs will be considered as foreign bodies by the immune system of the caterpillar, which will try to eliminate them. As long as these cells were alone, sleeping and inactive, they were not detected. But when they become active and start to gather, then they are detected by the system of the caterpillar as a threat. But this is too late, because the imaginal discs multiply and begin to weld together. The immune system has no choice and has to capitulate, and all the other cells become a sort of nutritional mash for these imaginal cells that will then create the miracle we know as a butterfly. The collapse of the caterpillar structure is essential for the arrival of the butterfly. It is interesting to make a parallel between the transformational process and what is happening in our society. To come back to the situation in my country, it's obvious that the attacks against me are not directed only at me personally, but at me as a representative of new ideas, new systems, new models in psychology, in spiritual development, in ways of considering the healing process, and so on. Transpersonal ideas and visions interest and convince more and more people today. That's why the general public is attracted by what we offer. But at least in my country, maybe it's not only in my country, the mainstream and the authorities are afraid and try to reject us and do their best to eradicate people like me and maybe like you. At the beginning of this transformational process, there are large numbers of individual imaginal cells, but as they gather, they start to exchange to create a common future. The whole structure refuses this kind of change, which threatens its way of running the world. So, its leaders will do their best to fight against the change and try to destroy the imaginal cells initiating the process. This has happened in societies many times throughout history. When a system is predominant, it wants to keep the power. But progressively, people will create something new, share their new ideas, and start to create small changes in their community or field. When the head of the system realizes its word is questioned and threatened, the political leaders and their administrations can become aggressive and violent to stop this process. They can win battles. But if the number of imaginal cells trying to cooperate is sufficient, then the metamorphosis will happen sooner or later. The good news, there is a good news, is that this process is irreversible. We, the transpersonal community, are creating the imaginal discs for giving birth to a future and new structure in our societies. We don't have to fight. We don't have to reject the old paradigm. We just have to stay connected to the other cells, to the other groups. We just have to stay connected to the other cells and the other groups. Even if we have differences in our visions, the transformation will happen anyway. Elizabeth Sattouris, I think she's from Greece probably, who is an evolutionary biologist, expresses it like this. If you want a butterfly world, don't crush the caterpillar, but join other imaginal cells to build together a better world for all of us. The interesting point also is that the transformation from the caterpillar to the butterfly is not a progressive process. It's really the death of the caterpillar and the birth of an entirely new, different being with new possibilities, like flying, for example. Maybe we'll fly soon. Are we facing the death of the old materialistic paradigm, which is condemned, and the rebirth of a new humanity with spiritual connections between human beings and between human beings and nature? Rudolf Barrow, a German philosopher and a political figure in his country, said, when an old culture is dying, that those who are not afraid of insecurity who will create the new culture. We need to work together and collaborate to give birth to this new world and avoid the destruction of our species and maybe of our planet. I think that as transpersonal associations, to address to the world. And remember, we just need a sufficient number, a critical mass to make the difference. Thank you.
So I would like to thank our keynote speakers, David Luca and Bernadette Blin. For time purposes, we just flow from one to the other, but I would really ask you all just to try to make an effort to be on time. It is quite important because it can be quite distracting with people coming and going. Tomorrow morning and every other morning at 8:45, the lyre player will be here playing the lyre. Now you have a coffee break. Please go to the Dionysus bar where you have your coffee break. And please be back at just a couple of minutes before 11 when we start again. Thank you.